This episode is brought to you by Black Butler, Parody of the Phantomhives, a Black Butler abridged series / parody. Thank you. Greetings, mortals. Welcome to another session of the Infernal Court in musical hell. I'm Diva, your judge, jury, executioner, and let's take a moment to talk about a type of musical I like to call a silly fluff show. Silly fluff shows are musicals that are uncomplicated, easily accessible, and have no agenda beyond entertaining the audience for a couple of hours. There's no soul-wrenching drama or deep statements about life and the world. It's just silly fluff. And that's okay. If there's one thing we've learned over the past couple months, it's that mindless entertainment can provide a much-needed mental break. On the structural level, silly fluff shows can even be very good. On the Town and A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, despite their high composer pedigree, are essentially lighthearted exercises in fun romance-based hijinks. But in many cases, a silly fluff show is something you need to be in a certain frame of mind to enjoy, otherwise it just comes off as, well,
stupid.
And nowhere is that clearer than the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. No, we can't just rush in on a masterpiece of fail like that. Such delicacies must be properly savored. We're going farther back for our next offender, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So in 1965, a 17-year-old Lloyd Webber first met up with a 20-year-old songwriter named Tim Rice. After their first collaboration, called The Likes of Us, failed to generate interest, they were commissioned to write a piece for the Colette Court School Choir. The result was a 20-minute pop cantata based on the Old Testament story of Joseph and his brothers. Normally, this would be the sort of juvenilia that artists evolve from and eventually look back on with embarrassment, but after the success of Jesus Christ Superstar, Lloyd Webber and Rice went back to their other biblically themed piece and expanded it into a 2-act musical, which ran in assorted English and US venues in the 70s and 80s. This particular iteration is a heavily toured revival from the 90s, which was filmed after the success of the first and less nightmarish attempt to preserve cats for posterity. But again, that's a story for a different day. For now, let's examine the case of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. The framing device is that we're seeing a show put on for a bunch of school children, appropriate given the musical's provenance, and in Wizard of Oz / Rocky Horror form, the lead actors are all double cast as the faculty. After a bit of futzing about, the narrator, the only female part of any significance in this piece, comes in and starts us off with a little prologue.
Some folks dream of the wonders they'll do before their time on this planet is through. Some just don't have anything planned. They hide their hopes and their heads in the sand.
This entire opening is pitched at about the depth of those greeting cards that contain dense cursive lines of pseudo-poetry, so you get a pretty good idea of what we're in for. The narrator brings in Joseph, played by whitest white boy ever, Donny Osmond, and his overly enthusiastic personal fog machine. Seriously, I'm expecting an entirely different Lloyd Webber musical to break out here. And so we get another prologue.
Far, far away, someone was weeping, but the world was sleeping. Any dream will do.
Yeah, we're gonna call sin number 1 on doubling up on the introductions. Part of the problem is that the sentiments in both songs are generalized and vague, so it feels excessive. There's also Osmond's intensely earnest manner, which I fear is going to be his main mood for the evening. Finally, with much fanfare, we are taken into the story proper and the land of Canaan not long after the Bible began, where we're introduced to the patriarch Jacob and his even dozen of offspring.
Jacob and Sons, a remarkable family in anyone's book.
So let's talk about the staging of this whole thing and why it bothers me. Like the earlier Cats, this is essentially a filmed stage production, but they seem to have made attempts to make it look less like a stage performance, and the results are definitely peculiar. The sets look less cartoonish and fun and more like a cheap Sunday school sing-along video, and have the weird effect of feeling like bad CGI even though I'm pretty sure they're not. The fourth wall gets broken so much it could do stunt work for a Kool-Aid commercial, and the movie can never seem to decide what to do with the children's chorus. Are they just observers? Do they enter the story and take part in it? The movie tries to have it both ways, and it results in some strange effects, like having Joseph surrounded by kids while he's languishing in prison.
Close every door to me. Keep those I love from me.
Anyone else getting a Spamalot vibe from this scene?
He's all alone, apart from us.
Richard Attenborough as Jacob explains that young Joseph is the son of his most beloved wife, which makes him the apple of his dad's eye. His other 11 boys don't take kindly to this blatant favoritism, and would be chewing the scenery with rage if there was any scenery worth chewing. But Jacob, who is kind of bad at this whole parenting thing, is oblivious to the rift among his offspring, and makes matters worse by giving Joseph his gaudy trademark coat. And Joseph, who takes after his dad in the observation department, can't stop bragging about it.
I look handsome, I look smart, I am a walking work of art.
To make matters worse, Joseph starts having dream ballets indicating he is destined for greatness.
My sheath was quite a sight to see, a golden sheath and tall. Yours were green and second-rate, and really rather small.
And I'm sorry, but it is really hard to like Donny Osmond's Joseph. The character already has a double dose of smug as written, and Osmond's vaguely wistful and/or oblivious demeanor isn't helping much. So the other 11 brothers decide this Joseph must die, and they rough him up and toss him into a convenient oubliette. They plan on leaving him there to die, but change their minds when a couple of mannequins on a cheap prop camel saunter by and sell him into slavery instead. A fate that the movie chooses to illustrate with a cut that is a bit too on the nose.
Situation's grave, hey, soul to be a slave.
To cover their tracks, the brothers tear up Joseph's coat and cover it in goat's blood, telling Jacob that Joseph was killed by wild animals and, oh sweet Lucifer, here we go.
Father, we've something to tell you, a story of our...
this fucking song.
Sin number 4, One More Angel in Heaven, ranks near the top of the worst Andrew Lloyd Webber songs list, and that's quite an accomplishment with enormous chunks of Woman in White and Love Never Dies in contention. There is quite a lot of pastiche in this musical, indeed in a lot of Lloyd Webber shows, and at its best it can be kind of fun. At its worst, as is the case with this exercise in exaggerated twang and soprano warbling, it's embarrassingly painful. Which is probably to be expected when a British composer is trying to mimic a quintessentially American music genre. Joseph is taken to Egypt and sold to Potiphar, a wealthy man who is basically what the James Corden role would be if this movie were being made today. Joseph's ability to suck up wins Potiphar over, and he's given charge over the whole household, but unfortunately for Joseph, his boss's wife is a seductive temptress with an entourage that makes the average staging of King Herod's song look like a Seventh-day Adventist prom. So Joseph turns down his mistress's advances, she sexually assaults him and plays the victim when they get caught, causing Joseph to get tossed into prison. Yeah, I know, but that's how it goes in the source material, so what are you gonna do? Having been cast into the shock treatment asylum, Joseph is left with nothing but the show's power ballad for consolation.
If my life were important, I would ask, will I live or die?
Again, Osmond looks more perplexed than determined in the face of adversity, but this is some decent power pop park and bark. The narrator in the chorus encouraged Joseph to keep his spirits up, because hey, he's the star of the show. And indeed, the key to Joseph's salvation comes when Pharaoh's butler and baker are thrown into prison with him and need some help with dream interpretation. The butler's dream promises a swift release, but the baker isn't so fortunate.
Pharaoh has it in for you. Your execution date is set.
Whoa, this is getting into some pretty dark territory for what's supposed to be a lighthearted family show, especially since it comes right in the middle of the upbeat and impossibly garish Act 1 finale.
Sha-la-la, Joseph, you're still in your prime. You and your dream goes ahead of your time.
It's like Austin Powers threw up in the middle of the Luxor Casino. Anyway, after a bit of... the narrator comes in to explain that Pharaoh is pretty much in charge of everything around here, while Joseph is still languishing in prison, even though the guards like him because Joseph has this knack of being ridiculously favored wherever he goes. Seriously, it's a whole thing throughout the source material.
Strange as it seems, there's been a run of crazy dreams.
This is one of those Lloyd Webber songs that goes on for at least one chorus longer than it needs to. In fact, sin number 5 is that you can really sense all the filler that was thrown in to stretch this thing out to feature length, from excessive reprises to tangential character numbers to pretty much all of the dance sequences. This could have easily been a one-act show and nothing of value would have been lost. Anyway, back to Egypt, where Pharaoh has been having some unpleasant and confusing dreams, which normally would be a sign that he should lay off the honeyed dates and beer right before bed, but this is the book of Genesis and dreams mean things. Luckily, his butler is on hand to give Joseph a referral.
Pharaoh said,
Well, fetch this Joseph man. I need him to help me if he can.
Yeah, Pharaoh is basically an Elvis clone because he's the king, get it? Actually, the joke mostly works, and the production is really committed to it. The court has blue suede shoes and everything. Even if the ending of his big solo is another bit of overindulgence.
Hey!
Still, props to Robert Torti for pulling out his best Conrad Birdie for the occasion. Long story short, Joseph explains the dreams are not too subtle metaphors for 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine, and urges Pharaoh to implement a long-term plan to store up the surplus harvest against hard times, preferably with a young go-getter Israelite in charge.
Who this man could be, I just don't know.
This man could be, I just don't know.
Who this man could be, I just don't know.
Joseph's obvious sucking up for the job isn't endearing him very much to me, but it works. He gets appointed as Pharaoh's second-in-command and a snazzy new wardrobe, and his efforts to mitigate the effects of the famine are so successful that the entire female chorus wants a piece of him. The narrator points out that since Joseph is doing all right for himself, we should probably check in on how his family is handling the crisis. Turns out the answer is not good, as they're lamenting their misfortunes in a Jacques Brel knockoff I like to call Sin Number 6, Those Canaan Days.
Extravagant, elegant soirees.
The gayest the Bible has seen.
Of the 3 extraneous pastiche songs in the show, don't worry, we're getting to the third one, this one contributes the least plot-wise, and it's not like the other 2 are structurally necessary. It's mostly an excuse for subcluso accents and ooh-la-la business. Oh, and apparently the brothers get their dad a hooker to cheer him up. Even the narrator seems to acknowledge that this scene is a bit of a plot cul-de-sac.
so,
With few options available, Joseph's brothers decide to head on over to Egypt to see if they can get in on some of that surplus grain. They don't recognize Joseph in his new headdress and gold eyeliner, so Joseph decides to test their character. After a bit of payback humiliation, of course.
Grovel, grovel, cringe house to fall. Worship, worship, beg, kneel, sponge, crawl.
After they throw themselves under his feet for a bit, Joseph relents and provides them with some rations. Out of a giant slot machine. Well, I guess if Pharaoh is Elvis, it only makes sense that Memphis would be Las Vegas. But Joseph also sneaks a goblet into youngest brother Benjamin's sack and accuses them of thievery as the kids go full-on panto audience.
is it Reuben? Is it Simeon? Is it Naphtali? Is it Dan?
Joseph demands Benjamin's arrest, but the brothers beg to be punished instead, and I think this bit deserves a little more context. See, both Joseph and Benjamin were children of Jacob's favored wife Rachel, and with Joseph missing and Rachel dead in childbirth, Jacob got super protective of her remaining offspring. He was very reluctant to let Benjamin go to Egypt in the first place, only relenting when eldest son Reuben promised to protect the boy with his own life. What we're seeing here is the brothers acknowledging their responsibility to their sibling and their father, honoring the family bond that they had sullied in their dealings with Joseph. It's actually a pretty moving climax to the story. And how do we commemorate such a cathartic moment? With a dopey calypso number, of course.
Oh no, not he. How you can accuse him is a mystery. Save him, save me.
Dramatic inappropriateness aside, this song also contains what is possibly the dumbest Tim Rice lyric ever.
No ifs, no ifs, no buts, no buts. Benjamin is honest as coconuts.
If I were Joseph, I would imprison these guys for making him sit through this. But he realizes his brothers have learned their lesson and reveals himself to them with much dancing and hugs all around. Jacob comes to Egypt and gets to see how well Joseph has done for himself. There's a touching reunion. Everybody gets a breather for a few generations before all the shit in Exodus comes up. There are a few more extraneous choruses, and we get a finale that Mel Brooks would be proud of. Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat is dumb, but it's mostly a harmless dumb, one that just wants to be a crowd pleaser for a family audience. That explains why it turns up so often in regional repertoires, which makes it a good gateway show for the kids who either saw it as their first live performance or participated in the cast, and that's always a good thing. Still, you wouldn't want a steady diet of this stuff, which is why the Court of Musical Hell condemns those involved to eat nothing but whipped cream. So let it be recorded. This session of the Infernal Court in Musical Hell is now adjourned.